Okay, we're live.
Okay. Well, maybe we should get started. Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to everyone from Canada and hopefully some friends and colleagues, perhaps outside the country. Thank you for joining our session on knowledge mobilization in refugee research. We are part of the Refugee Research Network, which has been a Canadian and global network of researchers and research centers committed to the study of refugee and forced migration issues. And it's based at York Center for Refugee Studies. And CARFNS, in fact, had its origins in the RN many years ago. I'm Susan McGrath. I'm Professor Emerita and Senior Scholar at York Center for Refugee Studies and School of Social Work, where I was also Director of the Center. In fact, the work of the RN was recognized in 2015 with the award of the Order of Canada. Our panel members have all been active in the RN, and particularly with our recent focus on knowledge mobilization. And we've been seeking ways to support and facilitate the broad dissemination of knowledge on forced migration across different fora and sectors. I would like to introduce the leaders of the workshop, who are all affiliated with the Center for Refugee Studies. We'll start from the West. Dr. Julie Young, whose research focuses on border issues, is Assistant Professor and Canada Research Chair at the University of Lethbridge, Alberta. We'll move to Toronto. Irina Osminin is a graduate student in clinical psychology in the University in Toronto, now known as X, as it waits for its new name. Here at York, we have Dr. Dina Taha, whose research has focused on gender in the Middle East, and she's also a knowledge mobilization specialist in York's Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies. Michele Millard is the longtime coordinator of the Center for Refugee Studies and has helped to create the tools and support knowledge mobilization at the center and at the RN. I will now pass things over to Irina for some of the administrative guidelines to our session.
Thank you, Susan. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Irina. I'll be your moderator today. Dina and Michele will be moderating the chat, answering any general questions, and we'll be sharing some useful links with you today. This workshop is meant to be interactive, so we really welcome any questions and thoughts. It's a tradition to start with a land acknowledgement. Since this meeting is being held online, a singular land acknowledgement does not capture the richness of our distribution across many locations in Canada and around the world. As the Refugee Research Network is hosted at York University in Toronto, we would like to share the land acknowledgement that is used at York University. And we invite you to consider your own territory as well. The Refugee Research Network acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lake region. The Dish with One Spoon is an Indigenous hunting law used for centuries. One spoon signifies that all peoples sharing the territory are expected to limit the game they take to leave enough for others. I invite us all to reflect on this meeting and how it might inform our work and our research. And now just to take you through a few housekeeping items. My screen is lagging a little bit. There it is. So please keep yourself muted during the presentation. This will allow the speaker to present without any interruptions. There will be designated periods for questions and discussions during the presentation, so please feel free to either share your question or comment in the chat, or simply indicate that you have a question or comment and then that you would like to ask yourself during the question and discussion period. We will then either call on you to ask your question or read out your question, depending on your preference. Additionally, we will be using a platform called Mentimeter throughout the workshop. This platform will allow you for anonymous participation. Throughout the presentation, there will be slides that are meant to be interactive. This will require you to open a web browser, and where you would go to menti.com. This will take you to a screen asking for a code. We will provide the code once we reach that screen. The code will be displayed on every interactive slide, and we will also share the code in the chat box. Once you enter the code, you can participate by entering your responses. Once you have already entered the code, you can follow along with the presentation. And if it doesn't take you to the correct slide, just click refresh or go to slide, and this should take you to the correct slide. Please note that after the workshop, all of the typed responses can be downloaded in a PDF format, and we can potentially share this PDF as a form of knowledge mobilization through social networks. But as I already mentioned, your responses are completely anonymous. And now we're going to give it a trial run. Okay, so how's everyone feeling today? I realize some of us are in different time zones, so we may be in different points of our day. Let's log into menti.com, enter the code at the top of the screen. It's 87825994. Once you're on that screen, please go ahead and let me know if you are, how you're doing today. I'm also going to give a couple of minutes. Oh, excited. That's awesome. Going to give it a couple of minutes. And if you are having any technical difficulties, please let us know in the chat. We'll troubleshoot. Dina, let me know if there's anything in the chat.
Will do.
Awesome, excited, a bit tired, energized, great, curious, engaged, awesome, wonderful. Another tired, I'm tired too, but excited. Okay, so I'll take it that we've all been able to log into Menti, which is great news. And now I will pass it back to Susan McGrath, who is the force behind RRN, and she will share a little bit about the journey. Pleasure to be here with you. Over to you, Susan.
Thank you. Thanks, Irina. Much of the work of the Refugee Research Network has been documented in the book that you see the picture of, Mobilizing Global Knowledge. Julie Young and I edited it. And we had colleagues from Canada, the US, Colombia, South Africa, India, Iran, contributing on issues related to power and politics, emerging research approaches, and the ethics of knowledge production. The book is published by the University of Calgary Press and is fully available online. You can download it as a one complete PDF, or the chapters are available separately. And I highly recommend the press to you when you're trying to do online work, make your work accessible and available online. So we also then want to talk a little bit about the objectives, give you an overview of what we're trying to accomplish here today. We've set some objectives and with an overview. We're certainly asking about the meaning of knowledge mobilization, particularly in the context of refugee and enforced migration research. And looking at identifying what are the tools that we've been working with and we found effective, and to explore the tools that you are also using. And consider the most appropriate KM methods for a different audience. What do you use? What is the best strategy or tool resource given the different audiences you want to communicate with? And what are the opportunities and limitations of different KM tools for different regions? And language, of course, is an obvious one, but there are many others in terms of different regional capacities. And also looking at the impact of COVID, what has been the impact of COVID and our reliance, our ongoing reliance, increased reliance on virtual tools, and how that is supporting or getting in the way of knowledge mobilization. And finally, where do we go from here? We're looking at trying to improve our capacity, maybe developing, a knowledge, a community of knowledge makers in terms of knowledge mobilization, and of course having questions and answers. So that's how we will finish off, and everyone will participate in that session. Okay, so now I want to hand it over to Julie, who starts with the exploration of the meaning of knowledge mobilization.
Great, thanks so much, Susan. I did unmute myself, so hopefully you can hear me okay. So now we're going to invite you in before we get too much further into the discussion to get some initial thoughts about what the term knowledge mobilization means to you. So I'm going to invite you to go, if you're not already on that screen, to go back to the Menti screen in your web browser. So just to repeat, it's menti.com. And if someone else could remind me of the number or put the number back in the chat. But essentially, we'd like to, with this interactive component, we'd like you to just, throw words out there that come to mind when you hear the term knowledge mobilization. How would you describe it, like what it is or what it does? Ooh, bridges, that's a great term. Ooh, we've got lots of connection, translation, knowledge. And you can, I should note that you can enter more than one word, as you are probably figuring out as the word cloud grows here. Public responsibility, I think that's a really important one. Partnership development, impact, activating stakeholders. I see engagement getting larger as some of the other terms get smaller. Integration of global experience, I see in the chat. Let me just go to the chat and see if there's anything else coming up. Thanks, Rabindra. Activating stakeholders. We've got different words that all speak to connection. Empowerment, I think, is a really important one. Research activism. Okay, these are all great. And I think we can see some clear themes coming through that for you, knowledge mobilization is about activating and engaging research. It's about involving stakeholders, right? Empowering perhaps research participants, thinking about research as activism and having impact, and as a public responsibility, right? That research shouldn't exist in a vacuum, right? So thanks so much for your participation. Maybe we'll move into the next slide. So I think many of the words that you've put forward are captured in, we'll share just a couple of definitions. So this is the definition from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, which for those of you not familiar with it in Canada, is the federal government funding agency that supports research in the social sciences and humanities. And we can see here, they capture the reciprocal and complementary flow and uptake of research knowledge between researchers, knowledge brokers, and knowledge users, both within and beyond academia, in such a way that it may benefit users and create positive impact. So I think that definition captures a lot of the terms that all of you contributed to our previous discussion. And I think many of these terms and ideas in the definition, Dina in her section will get into in a bit more depth. Right, so thinking about who audience members are, thinking about how to have impact and integrating that in, right? So thinking about it as part of the process of research, not sprinkled in as an afterthought, but the importance of integrating it from the beginning. I think we have another definition on that slide, Irina. This is sort of a more simplified definition that we sometimes think through knowledge mobilization as the strategic engagement and dissemination of evidence, research, and expertise to audiences beyond academia to impact policy and practice, right? I think that one's a bit more academia. Well, they're both academia focused, I think, because that's the position we're coming from, but clearly we also acknowledge that knowledge doesn't only rest with the expertise in academic institutions, but to think about research and knowledge production as a relationship with people producing and sharing knowledge from different positions. Great. Okay, let's move on to another question. So thinking of, drilling down into this a bit more specifically in our context, the next question is sort of, what is knowledge mobilization in the context of refugee research, right? Are there particular things that we as researchers in the fields of refugee or forced migration studies that we need to keep in mind in relation to thinking about knowledge mobilization? Are there particular responsibilities to keep in mind with knowledge mobilization practices and relationships? So I'll invite you to go back to menti.com if you're not already there, and to weigh in on this question as well. So what are some of the specific ways in which knowledge mobilization should or could happen in the context of refugee research? And you can weigh in through Menti, or you can also comment in the chat box. Or if you'd like to speak out loud, you're also welcome to do that. Great. Okay, so some similar or some related ideas to the previous discussion, but thinking about ethical considerations, engagement with specific sort of audiences or research producers, thinking about reciprocity in particular in the research process, thinking about what the needs of the audience are, maybe a bit more specifically. I'd love to hear more about this comment about balancing hypervisibility and visibility. I'm not sure if the person who raised that point would like to add a bit more to it, maybe in the chat or by putting more content in the next time, or if you'd like to unmute yourself. Because I think that's a really interesting contribution, and I'd love to hear more if the person who shared that is comfortable.
I can say something quickly.
Sure.
That was me.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Erin.
I was just thinking about the way that the refugee category is just like pervasive in popular culture and conversations. And so the way that individual voices get erased in that sort of hypervisible space. And yet research, knowledge mobilization is trying to make visible certain things about that experience. So kind of balancing, not contributing to that hypervisibility, which actually makes individuality invisible, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But still brings it out ethics. So it's the questions of ethics. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I think we can return to that in later discussions as well. Great. Anyone else want to weigh in here? I think we've sort of stalled out at some 6 comments. Yeah, if you have just joined, please go to menti.com and you need the code 87825994. But I think we see in many of these comments a real sense of the ethical underpinnings of research, which are always important in research projects, but I think particularly heightened in context of refugee research, thinking about reciprocity and sort of the power dynamics underlying research relationships as well. And thinking, I think, Erin, your comment also really highlights the ways in which, especially people who are displaced are often asked over and over to tell their stories, right, to different officials in different contexts, to demonstrate why their fear of persecution is valid, right, in order to get the status of refugees. And there's a sort of a real balancing that needs to happen in terms of, engaging with people's individual stories, but not sort of reducing them to their story, as you said. So I think that's a really important element of it. So let's move on to the next slide. We just wanted to draw your attention to a couple of projects that have happened recently, I'd say over the last sort of 3 to 5 years. I don't know the exact timing, but thinking, a number of organizations and individuals have put some thought into developing ethical guidelines for research in the context of forced migration and refugee studies. Our colleague, Christina Clark-Kazak, who used to be at York, but who's now at the University of Ottawa, really spearheaded an effort in Canada to bring people together around developing the set of ethical guidelines, and worked with the Canadian Council for Refugees to develop a set that's specific to the Canadian context, but I think also a bit generalizable. So we've linked to that in the bottom, and I should note that our PowerPoint with clickable links is shared as a document in the Feedloop profile for this session. So feel free to download that, because we are going to be mentioning resources throughout. And so you're welcome to follow up with those. If any of them are not working, just let us know and we can follow up with you. But another organization subsequent to the Canadian project, the International Association for the Study of Forced Migration, has also developed a code of ethics, right, specific to thinking about guidelines for doing research in the context of forced migration, right? And both of these documents highlight the importance of voluntary and ongoing informed consent, the importance of maintaining confidentiality and privacy, the importance of doing no harm, so proactively prioritizing things like dignity, safety, and well-being for both research participants and researchers, and really the importance of ongoing critical reflection. And these apply to the entire research process. And so we want to highlight the importance in any knowledge mobilization plans and practices of keeping all of these questions in mind, right? Especially considering contexts where people may be living with precarious legal status or with a different set of rights than those in the larger community. So the importance of keeping ethics at the center of knowledge mobilization practices. I think I'm handing it over to you now, Dina.
Yes, thank you, Julie. So just a quick refresher to the intro that Susan did at the very beginning. And of course, my son chooses to come into the room as I start speaking. So please ignore him. So I have been with the Refugee Research Network since 2016. And I have been working as a knowledge mobilization professional for the past 5 years. Sorry, give me 1 second. Sorry about that. And so I want to start with a couple of quick reflections or notes. And the first one is obviously, why do we need to plan for knowledge mobilization? And this is a very important question because it's going to drive how your knowledge mobilization strategy is going to look like. So you might want to consider, are you planning, are you doing knowledge mobilization as a funding requirement? Is it a requirement to demonstrate return on investment? Obviously, impact is, like achieving research impact is a major reason. Are you trying to create partnerships, develop relationships? Those are all things that would determine the direction that your knowledge mobilization plan is going to take. The other note is that while in social sciences and humanities, it's common to use the term knowledge mobilization, in other disciplines or in other countries, knowledge translation is used, dissemination and implementation science, like with our southern neighbors, and our knowledge exchange, even though I regard knowledge exchange as part of knowledge mobilization. So I say knowledge mobilization, hear knowledge translation, if that's your discipline. It is also important because this is a question, because part of my job as a knowledge mobilization specialist with liberal arts and professional studies is to support faculty members plan their knowledge mobilization plans specifically for grant applications. And some of them struggle with the difference between research outputs and knowledge mobilization. So we try to simplify that by saying that knowledge mobilization is more purposeful. So think about it this way. If knowledge mobilization is dissemination, the research outcome is diffusion. Like, it's not specific to a certain audience. It's just like pushing the outputs out there. It also entails, so knowledge mobilization also entails a clear idea of who the targeted audience is and how do they like to access information, and ultimately keeping in mind what is the desired impact. So knowledge mobilization. So the knowledge mobilization unit at York, thank you, Irina, at York University has developed some helpful frameworks and templates to help guide knowledge mobilization planning for faculty members. And again, my job was to try to simplify that for our busy faculty members by focusing on the following 4 components. It's not complete, and if you would like more detailed information about knowledge mobilization planning, we do provide resources at the very end. And as Julie mentioned, both the slides and any worksheets that we share are included in the feed loop page of this session. So that would be, the first component is audience or partners. And again, how do they like to access information? what is your message and goal? And once you determine those, then you can have the discussion around what are the suitable knowledge mobilization activities or tools that suit the audience and the message and the goals identified. And then evaluation and feasibility. And even though we're not gonna dig too much into details today on evaluation and feasibility, it is important to include them in the formula when you're planning knowledge mobilization. I think we're ready for the next slide, Irina. So the first element or the first component, the stakeholders or the audience. And again, it's very hard to distinguish between audience, end users, knowledge users, and partners. But I try to create this difference just to keep in mind this integrated knowledge translation side of things, where the end users could be part of the knowledge mobilization plan development. So that could be community partners, like nonprofit organizations, for example, that you're collaborating with, decision makers and policy makers, the general audience, general public, service providers, other researchers, and also people with lived experiences. Partners could be, again, there's a lot of overlap here, researchers, people with lived experience, funders, community organizations, and policymakers. And I invite you here, if I know this is not an exhaustive list, if you could think of any other audience that are relevant to specifically the field of refugee research, to add them to the chat. I don't think we have an interactive slide for that, but feel free to just use the chat to add them. And here it is important to emphasize some soft skills that are in consideration that Julie brought up in the ethics slide as well, that are important in order to have a meaningful relationship with the stakeholders. Partnership development, creating trust and reciprocity, as was mentioned in some of the discussion earlier, relationship building. In there, like also when dealing with indigenous populations, that require some additional precautions. So yeah, this is just something to keep in mind when we are incorporating audience or accounting for the audience needs. Next, Irina, please. So once we identify the audience, now we move to identifying our message and goals. So for the message is like, what is the message that you want to deliver? And that is not simply just sharing the results or the outcomes. Instead, you want to focus on why, so what or why should the audience care? And we try to simplify that, or like create a catchphrase that we refer to as this: what is your SNIT and your BLAM? So SNIT is the single most important thing, and the BLAM, the bottom line actionable message. And for that, you want to identify why are the research results important? What are the social, economic, and political implications that the research would have? And also that's usually a very easy way to think about it. What is the call to action? What are you asking the audience to do, or how to react to it? So an example to that would be this project, and this is a completely hypothetical example. This project advocates for 3 ways settlement workers can empower refugees during the resettlement process. Next, please, Irina. Maybe I should take advantage of the pause and see if there are any questions. Feel free to use it to add any questions in the chat. Okay, so knowledge mobilization goals, which is the purpose of communicating your main message about your research, which can be to create awareness, interest, or buy-in, to impart knowledge, communicate knowledge, to shape attitudes, inform research, inform decision-making, inform policy, sometimes which might not be, again, relevant to refugee research or social sciences, to commercialize discoveries. But I've worked with researchers who were working on developing apps, for example, for refugees. So that was quite a stimulating discussion about knowledge mobilization. And here, clarity and alignment about what is communicated, which is the message, to whom, which is the audience, and for what purpose, which is the goal. Once that's clear, it should inform the sort of knowledge mobilization tools and activities that you plan to incorporate. No, that's fine, Irina. I think we can go ahead to the next slide. So yeah, there's no shortage of knowledge mobilization tools and activities there. It's just a matter of narrowing it down to what is strategic, what is relevant for you and your audience and your messages. So the products that can include publications, and that includes also gray literature and specifically open access literature as well, summaries, news outlets, media relations, reports and summaries, research summaries, well, lots of summaries that I included here, toolkits. Yeah, this is something that I'm really interested in creating, like toolkits on how to do things. It usually gets a lot of positive response. Also creating websites, even though the field now is moving a little bit towards like being a bit critical about what sort of like, do we really need a website? And with the technological advancements, is there another way to do things? Like, for example, utilizing Facebook groups like Michele is going to walk us through. Infographics is one of my favorite ways to communicate messages, because it's just like, it's very quick and versatile, and you can use it in different domains. So that's for the products. There's also another way to, like for knowledge mobilization tools, which is through events and networks. So conferences, lunch and learn sessions or series, workshops, media events, creating community of practice, which we'd like to expand on a little bit in a few slides. Next, Irina, please. Yes, so layering. We always emphasize layering, knowledge mobilization. It doesn't have to be either or. It doesn't have to be like either an infographic or a summary or an event. People like to access information in different ways, and it also creates more exposure to your message. Repeating the message is effective. The most important thing here is consistency, making sure that the same message with the same call to action is coming out in those different tools. And Michele, again, will talk to us about some of our activities at the Refugee Research Network. And you can see that we've used, for example, summaries, videos, workshops to mobilize the same work. Okay, so impact. Again, as mentioned, I'm not going to go into too much detail because this is like a whole other topic. But just one thing to emphasize here is the reason why I include it is that, as Julie mentioned at the beginning, it can be like evaluation can be an afterthought. It needs to be part of your planning from the very beginning to make sure that you would have the necessary data and necessary resources to be able to measure your impact. You will notice from the indicators that are included here that it doesn't have to be quantitative. Actually, I was just in a community of, like, it's called Research Impact Canada. It's a community of practice for knowledge mobilizers. And they were talking about how right now storytelling is a big part of measuring impact nowadays. If you would like more information about evaluation and measuring impact, I've included at the bottom of this slide, which is also available to you. At the bottom here, the knowledge mobilization toolkit is a very easy and straightforward document that any non-specialist can use. So I highly recommend starting with it. Next, Irina. Yes, so again, this is like a very busy slide that I'm not planning on going through. I just left it in there for your reference if you want an example for knowledge mobilization planning. This is an actual project that I worked on and presented the knowledge mobilization for. It is just for your reference. It's included in the slides. Feel free to refer to it. I'll leave my contact information at the end. I'm happy to discuss it as well. And yes, so this is the worksheet I was referring to. It is included in our the feed loop page of our session. Feel free to download it, customize it, use it for planning, like initial planning for knowledge mobilization. I highly recommend not doing it on your own. Or the way I like to do things, I start with like the very basic ideas, and then I share it with the different stakeholders to have something to react to. So however your working style is, just I highly recommend that you don't fill it or finalize it on your own. And yeah, I included here some considerations like the importance of alignment, remembering how does the selected knowledge mobilization tool actually suits the audience and how they like to access information, and including how will you measure your success. And obviously also there's an important equity, diversity, and inclusion element to everything that we're doing for ethical research. I'm happy to take feedback on this worksheet, by the way, whether during the session or at any point afterwards, because there's like knowledge mobilization is always a field that's growing and expanding, and I'm sure there are lots of blind spots. Okay, so back to the interactive part of the session. So if we can send a reminder of the website and the ID, please go back to menti.com. Oh, and it's up there actually, menti.com, and the code is 87825994. And the question to you is actually not showing on my end. What are the activities? What knowledge mobilization tools and activities have you found useful at your institution? I'll actually give it 30 seconds, which will create some awkward silence, especially for online settings, but that's okay, because I encourage you all to participate and share with us ideas. That could be tools that you found useful. If you would like to share tools that have been particularly challenging, feel free to use the chat as well, and we're happy to discuss it. So I see some of the answers coming in. Webinars, obviously, there has been a rising caution, however, around webinar fatigue. Like there's webinars everywhere. So even at liberal arts and professional studies at York University, we're trying to rethink the model, trying to come up with ways. We think that the Menti offers a very good alternative for interactions that is not one directional. But we are trying to rethink the model a little bit so it's not redundant and that there isn't just, it doesn't contribute to the, what's it called? They call it the online noise or the Zoom noise. There's media production team. It would be interesting to expand on that. Is it working? Is it having the media team that is dedicated to content development and promotion? Because I've worked with groups and organizations who have a dedicated communications team, and it makes a huge difference. I agree. Infographics, obviously, and now like there are lots of software like Canva, for example, which we include a link for in the resources. And I think Michele is going to talk a little bit about it as well. Infographics is at your fingertips now to create, even if you're not a graphic designer. Pedagogical resources, that would be interesting. I invite you to expand on that a little bit, because it's not a very common knowledge mobilization tool, even though I've heard critique from our faculty members that there's now push for all those non-academic channels and tools, like infographics, webinars, videos, social media, and all of that, that might be taking away from the importance of having academic peer-reviewed research. So we always have to remind that it's not either or, and that layering is very relevant to the very activity of knowledge mobilization. Summaries, of course, podcasts. It would be interesting to see. Because we're working also on the refugee, the RN digest. We've seen a couple of actually an increasing number of podcasts, and the quality has been increasing. So I'm glad that's something that some of the attendees is using. Infographics and social media engagement. Social media, it is, for me personally, social media is a challenge, because even in my personal life, I'm not a social media person. So it's never spontaneous on my end, and it requires planning, and we're always looking for templates that would simplify and organize and schedule social media posts and social media engagement. So if you have any resources about that, please share with us. Summaries obviously is at the center of knowledge mobilization and infographics, and Twitter, which is part of social media. So I'm glad that there's lots of responses around knowledge mobilization tools, which means that a lot of the group is, a lot of the attendees are actually implementing knowledge mobilization tools. Okay, moving on. Translating, oh, I see a larger one. Translating research into teaching, developing education workshops, activities, etc., that build from research findings and data. Yes, that is very important. Creating modules and toolkits and educational workshops is definitely very important. And in that case, the targeted it's also determined by the targeted audience. Okay, moving on, because I think I'm running out of my time. So yeah, I'll take another pause here for any questions. Just give it another 20 awkward seconds for any questions. And if there's none, I believe I'll turn it over to Michele, who's going to walk us through some of the Refugee Research Network knowledge mobilization activities. And Michele wears a lot of hats. I don't know how she does it, but she does it somehow. But now she's a knowledge mobilizer. So Michele, over to you.
Okay, somebody has to forward or advance the slides for me. I'm not connected to the admin part of this, right? Okay, so I'm just taking a very few minutes to talk about the sort of concrete social media and knowledge mobilization activities they are engaged in over the last, I guess the project started in 2008. So it's been, you know, a child is born and half grown by now. So we've experimented a lot over the last few years, and there are some things that worked very well and some things that worked less well. So one of the things that we've managed to continue to do is the RN Research Digest that we publish every few weeks on the RN website. And people seem to find it very useful. I've lost the word, not index, but you know, it's digest. It's a digest of some key research events or publications or different kinds of forms of knowledge around refugee research that we identify and promote. And people also connect with us to get their work promoted on the digest. So that, you know, it has a home on the website, and then it gets promoted through the listservs and Twitter and Facebook groups. So it does have a potential to reach tens of thousands of people. Next slide, please. Yeah, as I said, we tweet, we Facebook, we share in the groups, LinkedIn groups, and we also discovered MailChimp. I just want to have a quick word around Facebook. It's an interesting group that's there, despite the fact that Facebook seems to now becoming a bit of a tool of the devil. But the Facebook group on the RN, we have almost 50,000 people on it. And so, you know, the engagement, I would say, is a partial engagement, more like reacting to what is being posted. But we also have a core group of people that post regular information around news and research and book publications and webinars and academic programming and so on. So it does fulfill the function or the purpose, that it functions according to the purpose of the group. So that's really great. I also think it's an underused resource. I mean, 50,000 people is a kind of a semi-passive audience. I mean, they are self-identified as refugee positive, and they are a big mix of people, students and faculty, fair amount of refugees themselves who are looking for credible information, also policy and government and educational institutions, and people in Dina's position as knowledge mobilizers, that they push out their content. So, you know, it's a diverse group, but the advantage of a group like this is that because of the self-selection, you don't always have to justify your existence, like why you know, helping refugees is a good thing. So it provides a bit of a protective space. And I think people who engage in this group, they probably can think of doing more things, but I do understand, you know, people's workloads are high. But I nevertheless, I do think like the Twitter account is connected to the Facebook group, which is connected to the listservs, which is connected to the Facebook group. So all of these are sort of networked and interrelated with each other. And this kind of approach seems to be most effective in getting information out to the largest group of people who A, have a reasonable understanding of what's going on, and B, have a reasonable chance of actually picking it up and doing something with it. Can I have the next slide? What the other activities that we did over the last number of years is, and we continue to do, is collaborate with other organizations. So, for example, we do collaborate with Learn, which is a project, SSHRC-funded project coming out of Carleton with James Milner. Julie Young is in charge of refugee research in context. So that's another interesting way of disseminating knowledge. So we do encourage people to look at that. We've collaborated with ISFM. We've collaborated with, you know, loosely affiliated scholars with the network. And our collaboration is mostly because we help leverage outreach and dissemination. Next slide, please. Next slide. Oh, there we go. Okay, so, oh, okay. The research in context. So there is we did play around with a different format. And so this is a short excerpt of a video we created in Doodly of some that Dina created with some of her work. So I don't know if somebody can hit play. Oh, can you hear? Well, the audio is not there, but it gives you an idea of how
feminist international assistance policy play in offering effective and culturally appropriate solutions to achieve real gender empowerment? Dina Taha tried to answer these questions through her fieldwork in Egypt, where she interviewed 30 Syrian refugee women who married, will marry, or were separated from Egyptian husbands whom they got introduced to shortly after arriving in Egypt. The women had...
Okay, so that was just a quick example of one of the experiments we did. To be honest, I've done Doodly too, and it's actually it's kind of fun. You know, it's kind of fun to think about your work in a different way, in a sort of a non-academic, non-traditional way. So, and it was a useful experiment. And going forward, I do hope we can engage in more kind of revisioning of one's work. There. And of course, research snapshots. I mean, this came out of some work that Christina Clark-Kazak did. And we hired students, we trained them on how to do research snapshots, plain language summaries of academic research. So it's not a skill that's being taught in the academy. So it's a useful skill to have. Going next one. And then these are some of the tools and resources that we've been using. I think we uploaded this presentation, so you'll have the live links available. We also played around with Canva. You can do a lot of stuff with Canva these days. So you would be able to access these links, I think, through the uploaded document that's in the file section of the feed loop session. So, and I think that's it for me.
Okay, thanks, Michele. Thank you for taking us through those examples. I know I personally find the concrete examples super helpful. Now we're going to switch gears a little bit. Consider knowledge mobilization in the context of COVID-19. So I'll ask you to log back on to menti.com and let me know, what do you think are the challenges for KM as a result of the pandemic? So again, if you're joining now, just menti.com and the code is 8782-5994. Zoom fatigue, yes, we can all relate to that, right? I'll give it a couple of minutes so everyone can put in their answers. Digital divide, yes. Less engagement with events and content. Challenges with productivity, absolutely, for many reasons. Additional responsibilities and concerns outside of research and workload. There's actually too much information floating around. Yes. It's almost like a balancing act, right? You get the digital technology to sort of open up the possibility of sharing resources and consuming information, but then there's also a limit to how much information you can take in. Attention spans are shorter. Also positives and opportunities. Yes, and we're actually going to get to that. More difficult to truly connect without in-person options. Yeah, for sure. Just like the, small talk, conversations in between presentations, right? We're missing that part. More opportunities for Global South researchers to participate in events. Yes, definitely. But then we also need to consider that digital divide. Sustained engagement, trust. Water cooler, small talks. Yes, exactly. Absolutely. Okay. So I feel like probably all of these have been now mentioned. Everyone can speak to Zoom fatigue in the past year and a half, and someone mentioned productivity challenges. So for many reasons, the pandemic has had great impact on equity, diversity, and inclusion, usually just leaving behind those that were most vulnerable. Those who were historically excluded are only further marginalized. Accessibility has been a big challenge. So when solely depending on technology to stay connected, there has been great digital divide, which one of you mentioned, in virtual meetings between the Global South and rural communities and the Global North because of poor internet connection and also just not enough tech support. There's a constant push for innovation and change and using new applications. So I think someone spoke to that as well. This can cause further online fatigue and digital divide too. There are varied cultural and institutional preferences that can lead to additional barriers when collaborating across different institutions and internationally. And of course, difficulties and delays in doing refugee research with all the global pandemic guidelines and restrictions. And someone did mention, pardon me, so I'm just lagging here. There it is. So there are clearly a lot of challenges as the result of the pandemic. However, with many challenges, there are also opportunities. And so let's consider the opportunities for a minute. I invite you all to please go back to Menti and let me know, what do you think the opportunities have been? I know someone has shared, was extremely positive, saying, well, there was actually opportunities as well. So I'm looking forward to hear from you. And by the way, if Menti doesn't take you to the correct slide, you can just hit, either refresh or go to slide, and it should take you to this screen. Ability to connect across geographies and time zones. Yeah, absolutely. Just like we're doing now too. There's definitely a pro to not having to travel and being able to access different information and even this conference through the comfort of your own home. No political borders, so more global inclusion. Yep, speaking to sort of the same. Developing virtual communication skills. Yeah, definitely. Access with caveats, yes. Yeah, so it's sort of, again, you know, there are some challenges, but also opportunities. So how do we maximize those opportunities and how do we address those challenges? More people online learned to easily connect across countries and cultures. Yeah. Save space if possible, definitely. Being able to attend, yeah, from my basement for sure. Yeah, it's great. That is definitely an opportunity. I'll give it just one more minute in case someone wants to add. Yeah, so I think we sort of discussed these. Yeah, we're all meeting virtually. There's an ability to reach a larger audience. We can employ digital technology for engagement and to gain a greater reach. And also the greater participation of researchers and participants at forced migration sites in generating that knowledge. Perhaps Susan can speak a little bit to a real life example later on. And yeah, I guess at this point, maybe let's discuss where we go from here. So I'll give it over to Susan.
Thank you, Irina. Yeah, so this last period of the session, we really would like to look at the future, and what we have been trying to think about is how we can build a community of practice around knowledge mobilization in refugee research. And what does that look like? And we invite your input in multiple ways and invite the whole team also, the time for questions and answers for the whole team. But what would be helpful to you if we're trying to build, are you interested in the community of practice, and what kind of resources would be useful to you to develop that? What would that look like? What do you need in order to improve your own practice around knowledge mobilization, to reach out more effectively to the audiences you're trying to reach? What resources do you need? And are you interested in participating in sort of the collaborative process? And for instance, what could we ask Carfins to do something to help facilitate connections among its members who are interested in really developing our knowledge and skills around knowledge mobilization? Because as researchers, we're so busy creating knowledge, but we're not always have been so good at getting it out there, particularly to groups that would benefit from it. And, you know, in our area, in terms of refugee and forced migrant populations, and, you know, practitioners, settlement workers, policy actors, certainly as we're seeing the changes going on in terms of research and all the issues around border building that's going on well across North America, Europe in particular. So what can we do to help build a community of practice around knowledge mobilization? What would you be interested in doing? Are you interested? What kind of activities would you be interested in? How could we best do that? And you can, I see there's comments here on the Menti board, which is great. You could also, if you want to join us orally, you could unmute yourself and make comments. We welcome that. It would be helpful to have a conversation around where we can go to next, because we really are hoping to take this in a direction and to get the research funds together to try and advance our work here. So I see the comments now about building relationships. So things that about building relationships, I'd be interested if you want to speak more about that in terms of, what kind of relationships we want to be building. We're talking about with other researchers in Canada, internationally, possibly some of our audiences, building relationships with policy actors or with service providers or with refugee population groups. The refugee groups are really organizing. We have diaspora groups that are organizing. So be interested in hearing more about the building of relationships. Addressing power dynamics and political economy research in this field, a huge issue, I would agree, and needs a lot of work. I think it's an area we've been struggling with on the Refugee Research Network from the beginning, the extreme power inequalities between the North and South. Our colleagues in the South can't even often stay online long enough to continue in a conversation, or asked to fill out forms. I don't know if you heard on the news today, the concern, of course, is that Afghans trying to get out. And one of those who are trying to help that group said, IRCC asked them to fill out forms to apply for status in Canada. And they're being told, download your latest form of, Adobe Acrobat. Well, how do you do that on a phone? They don't have access to it. So how do we address some of these inequalities in terms of communication? And I think also in terms of the political economy research, who has access to resources, capacities. And again, we've seen that in our own work, what's happening with our colleagues in the South. Universities, and most of them in the Global South, don't have the resources that we do. They may not even have a working printer half the time. So it's a bit of a challenge to them. Yeah, who should be invited to the discussion? Good question. That's, who should be included, and who should be included that we haven't thought of before. Instead of sticking to our sort of same networks, are there other groups that we'd like to bring into the group? Putting funding in the hands of the Global South. How do we get more resources and capacity into our colleagues, hands of our colleagues in the South? It's a big issue. And I think, how do we as people have access to Northern funders? And we're fortunate in Canada that, the Social Science Humanities Research Council in Canada has been very generous, and for the most part, in funding refugee research. But how do we then get that money to our partners in the South? It's difficult. And what is it we need? Things like translational science community to influence policy. I'd be interested in hearing more about that. How do we translate knowledge and science into language that can reach policy actors? I don't know if any of you work for government, and I did very briefly, but if you're going to give something to the brief, has to be one page. Policy workers will not read more than one page. So how do we get our knowledge into a form and accessible, and get it really the key messages right at the top, explaining why they need to do action on this issue? So any other comments or questions or interest in taking this forward together? Are you interested in being part of a network? And I don't know if, people who are linked to CARFMs, is there an interest in getting CARFMs involved? Could that be part of CARFM support to its members in terms of building capacity and addressing some of these issues? So if you have any suggestions or comments or questions, or anything also, if you want to ask anything about anything you've heard today, Dina covered a lot of material. So if you have any questions about the material that's been covered, or what you think would be useful for you, or in contributions too, if you have work that you've been doing that you think the rest of us would benefit from, would be really interested in hearing. There was a chance earlier on to say some of the things that you're doing, but we'd really be interested in hearing more about what is it that you're doing, or what is it you see for those of you who have colleagues in the Global South, what would be most helpful for them? What could we be doing differently? What have you found is helping if you're doing research and collaborations with colleagues in the Global South? What have you found that's useful? Oh, somebody has to run. Bye, Tansley. It's the time of day. I'm glad to be able to made it this long evening here in Toronto. Any other questions or comments? The rest of the team have some thoughts that they would like to add. How do we go forward? I like Dina's question. It's the person who commented on translational science. You have to add how that different from implementation science. Others have thoughts? I think we're down to a few of us. Judith, Melissa, Karine, thank you for continuing with us. If you have other thoughts or recommendations for us, because we are actually looking at putting together an application for connection grants. So we would be interested in hearing, we're trying to figure out how we can build a practice. Oh, Melissa, there you are.
Yes, and I am a researcher from the Global South. So,
Yay.
so I was in this session in ISFM, and it brought me lots of insights. So I came back to this context as well. So I believe when we talk about Global South, there's two Global Souths we have to talk about. There is a Global South that have more ingrained problems of accessibility and the digital gap and everything. But there's also a Global South that is producing research, in a wider array of languages that become more accessible to migrants in the Global South as well, but who don't have access to research from the Global North. So Refugee Research Network on Facebook is a massive lifeline for us. It's one of the main sources of information for us, for books being published in English, for resources that are open access and available. In Brazil, for instance, there's a lot of use of WhatsApp groups for dissemination of information. And we do notice that a lot of the information that is published on the Facebook group of Refugee Research Network is replicated in a lot of those WhatsApp groups across researchers in Brazil and in Latin America. So it is people who do read research in English, but also produce research in other languages. And sometimes we're locked out of that research because not all of it is open access. So being able to access the research would already be massive for us through partnerships that allow a password to hide online. That is the dream for any researcher in the Global South who has the privilege of having more access to the internet and having better conditions to do research than the majority of the researchers in the Global South. And I think that's a good bridge because we are sort of in the middle and we could help bridge that gap. Because we do produce in different languages. So I publish in Portuguese, I publish in Spanish, but I need to broaden the research I'm exposed to be able to produce good quality research in those languages and include more people and mobilize that knowledge to a wider network that is present in the Global South and that we have access to more easily because they are at our universities, they are in our communities, and they can benefit from our outreach projects inside in their own languages.
What would that look like, Melissa? Like, I'm thinking, so if research that's published in the North, a research summary is translated into Portuguese and Spanish, perhaps? And also alternatively, your work that's being done in Portuguese and Spanish has a research summary that's translated into English so that we can access your work.
Absolutely. That would be something very interesting, and that would bridge that gap. And we can collaborate, like researchers in the Global South could collaborate in that effort, because it's in our interest as well that research is available here. So mobilizing students who could do those translations, and having a multilingual platform, because not all researchers in the globe, in Brazil, for instance, can read research in English. Others can, but having access, because we feel that we're always a number of years behind in terms of what arrives to us when books get translated, when research gets translated. And as I said before, I mean, a massive issue is access to research that is not open access, because the universities here, even like top level research, there's no access to databases where we can find case law, or where we can find publications from the Global North. Like, even I mentioned this at the other workshop in July. Even when we publish, and we publish in English, we don't have access to our own research. We're locked out of our own research, and we can use that in course materials here, for example, because of the economics of paid publications and paid databases.
So your university libraries can't afford to pay for access to these databases, right?
To these databases.
Well, and I think, wasn't one of the original sort of ideas for a project or an initiative for the RN was this, I forget what it was called, the research database, which was trying to, I think, encourage more of this, making open access versions of research, whether that was executive summaries or, you know, the version, the pre-publication that the journal allows you to share, to make those accessible. So I almost wonder if, right, if that's an element of a project going forward, is to develop some kind of, whatever it might be, a global refugee research clearinghouse or something, right? With people who could at least do translations in multiple languages of like an executive summary or like an abstract for those pieces. Yeah.
One of the things we are working on is we're working with the York Library, because we have an archive, a forced migration archive. Right. And so that people, researchers in the South who aren't able to post like their publications on, they don't have in their own website, they aren't being archived, but they could post it there, and that would make it globally accessible. So, and they could do that in any language. You know, it would not necessarily have to be in English. You could just post it. It's like a pre-publication version of it. So, because some journals don't allow you to publish it, but if you can, sort of the version that just goes before it goes to publication, and that can be archived. So we're just experimenting with that now, but so that would make, or could potentially make published research in the South. Right now we're looking at what would be published by journals, but in the future we're thinking of also looking at gray literature, so that it could be published there. But it doesn't deal with the issue around summaries. And I think being able to produce summaries, and your suggestion that students could help with translation. So if a researcher were to write the summary, because in our experience, you need to get the researchers to write it. It's not always easy. But if they can just do like the one page of this is the message, this is it, and to make sure it's accurate and focused. And then if we can, students could then possibly translate that and make that available.
Absolutely. And a massive challenge here is also funding, right? We are operating on a very, well, everybody is, and this research is underfunded worldwide, but here there's zero funding for any research in the social sciences, basically because of the political scenario in Brazil. So it's that support in getting funds and sharing those funds. There's loads of qualified people that could be undertaking that research and that knowledge mobilization, but simply can't do that because, well, there's no funds, and people, there's so much they can do in their free time.
Yeah. Melissa, would you be interested in joining us? We are the next
Absolutely.
ISFM conference, as you know, is going to be in Brazil.
I'm in the organizing
She's on that
team.
committee.
Oh, are you? Yay! Terrific.
As soon as I saw you were at this session, Melissa, I was going to suggest that we should invite you in.
Wonderful. Great
No, I'd
minds
be
think
very, very happy to join and support and brainstorm and help in any way I can.
Terrific. Does somebody have your email? Julie, do you have Melissa's email? Or can we get it from you?
If Julie doesn't have it, I have it.
Okay, all right. Of course, Michele has everybody's email. Okay.
I know everybody.
And I'm like, I think I have you on Facebook, but I don't know if I have your email address.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I'm not sure. And I have a Canadian connection, Susan. I did my PhD at McGill.
Ah, okay.
And my husband's Canadian, so I do go to Canada often when traveling is allowed. So
Terrific. Oh, that would be great fun. I don't know where. Do we know where ISFM is going to be next time? Or maybe next time Cartham's, wherever that's going to be, it would be great to have you come up.
Well, and you studied, weren't you in the same program as Anna Perky?
I was.
That's right.
We actually
Susan knows Anna and Mary, I think. Mary Perky.
Yes.
Yeah.
Anna was there like halfway, like we overlapped. Like I started 2 years before her, or 2 or 3 years before her. So when I was finishing, she was starting.
Melissa, can you just put your email in the chat box just so we have it?
I just sent it to you in an email.
Oh, an email. Okay.
You got it. You got it.
Thank you, Michele.
And let me just say, Anna is now a CARFAM's executive member. So, I mean, I'm telling you, 200 people work in this field.
I know, right? It's a very small world.
Yeah. Well, and we need to be connected too really well. So anyway.
I think, Melissa, you are our audience now. So thank you for sticking through to the end.
Yes.